we have these numerous ways of minimizing strangeness. And in the context of the pandemic, however, we were denied those spaces to minimize strangeness. So the stranger was therefore informed by television, which of course relied off shock value and sensationalism, especially in the media.
You're listening to Good is in the Details. I'm Gwendolyn Dolske.
And I'm Rudy Salo.
And this is the podcast where we learn what we didn't know in the spirit of Socrates, all with the aim of a more knowledgeable life, a happy life. And today we have returning guest, Sociology Professor Dr. Jack Fong, and he has a collection of essays out called Reconfiguring Global Societies in Pre Vaccination Phase of the COVID-19 Pandemic. And this collection of essays is people writing about their experiences in different areas of the world with pre-vax societies and everything being shut down during the pandemic. And Professor Fong has his own essay in this collection, and that is the topic. And it is, it's a memory trip. What are the changes that have happened structurally as a result of everything shutting down? What did that happen to us communicating and relating and interacting? And it's a really, really fascinating discussion. It's a sobering discussion as well.
Yeah, I mean, and as much as we focus on how the pandemic changed us and had these lasting effects on society, I like how we didn't just focus on that. We really talked about some, quasi-controversial topics, right? About how have we been addressing each other in society? How have we been addressing each other in emails? What is going on in our country today? Why are we so divided? Why is there this extreme cultural divide? The extreme political correctness side versus the extreme anti-political correctness side, and how that came out of the pandemic, how we all are navigating these quote unquote sides in our country. And we had some very interesting discussions on this podcast episode that, might make some people uncomfortable, to be perfectly honest with you. But I think these are conversations I didn't even know that were being had on university campuses. So I appreciate Professor Fong's honesty. And I think it produced a fruitful discussion.
Yeah. From a sociologist's point of view, I've been thinking about his essay so much. I was so excited to talk to him because this idea of this third space, the public space that had been shut down, and I didn't realize how significant this public space was, that when you go out for coffee or down the street or even, the university classroom, that when you remove that public space, and it seems like we're created a vacuum and we're swapping it out with a virtual space. And I think that's partly what's leading to this division. It's not the same thing as, walking into a store and smiling at the stranger who's in front of you in line. Like, we've removed all of that interaction and swapped it out for algorithms and, talking into the void. And so we're, having a conversation about the impact of that. And it's very thoughtful, and Professor Fong is amazing. So yeah, we're going to be talking about the public square post-COVID. Jack, like I said, reading your essay in this collection that you've edited about returning to COVID and understanding the spaces, you've articulated something in your essay that has been, needling me for a long time, and the impact of COVID. But if we can just go back to the beginning of the way you introduce the organization of society and infrastructure, and then to talk about the impact of altering that, what that did. So what are some influences that make a society, these public spaces and the infrastructure?
Well, that's a really good question. Thank you so much for asking. I took a very I took a very urban sociological view of what COVID did to society, and a great deal of urban studies and urban sociology is about looking at how things are configured to give us quality of life. And that tact that was adopted for the book is primarily a response to psychology, because as we all know, during the lockdown period, many of us were in a funk and we were kind of falling into this abyss of our dark sides. And what I wanted to do was not let those in the psychological sciences have an exclusive narrative that says, okay, you have unresolved issues that are surfacing at 3 a.m. in the morning because you're unable to go out to your favorite restaurant. So what brought me to this edited volume, which I was able to very gratefully be able to work with my colleagues on, is that I'm trying to posit that the way society was configured up until that lockdown period did something to us, and it made us take that configuration for granted. So once that external world that satisfied our physical appetites was removed, only then did we kind of fall into that abyss of despair, perhaps, of being in a very bad funk. So the work was really about taking a global view on what happened to every single society that my authors were examining, and how those societies were reconfigured in ways that may or may not have affected individuals within their respective boundaries. So the book is really about privileging space, how de-stressing is really something that we can build into the environment. It's not necessarily about this mystical meditation and mindfulness that's so hip nowadays that you see floating in mainstream culture, about self-care, about being mindful, but it's simply about how your spaces are there and not there for you. In my particular context of looking at LA, what we are part of is this great automobile culture where we're allowed to drive to these little nooks and crannies that fulfill our sensory needs. And all of a sudden, during the lockdown period, that was removed from us. That was surgically just removed from us. It showed me a great deal of the American humanity at the time. And I'm not sure if I should extrapolate away from Los Angeles, but if I had to, I would say that we started to see how this materialist culture we're raised in has made us weaker in circumstances, because we realize without all of these contraptions that give us joy, a nightclub, a good chilled beer, a nice restaurant to sit in, without all of these contraptions and cultural spaces, we are lost.
Mm-hmm.
And I saw that happening with a lot of the folks I've examined in the American context and in LA. That people got lost because all of a sudden they realized they had to become their own friends. They had to, for the first time, maybe enjoy their own company. And that social media wasn't going to satiate their loneliness. They felt very bad about that. And a lot of them went through depressions. A lot of my students did. I was forced to go online and teach only synchronous courses, and many of them were going through severe crises. It was tough to watch, really, to be honest with you.
In your chapter, I mean, something that I that now I've glommed onto is the importance of strangers. That in the public space, that's part of our everyday life, is this interaction with strangers.
Yes.
And I've been thinking about that, like if you're at the grocery store and the line is really long, you have this like community experience where you and the person in front of you kind of look at each other and sigh, like
Yes.
something as simple as that. Or the other day I stopped and got coffee and somebody said, "Oh, I like your nails." And, just these very, very brief interactions
Yes.
that are part of the day with people you will maybe never see again.
Yes.
But that space was completely removed. So then we just have the work from home, and that was it.
Right. And that's a very good observation, because the great urban sociologist Lynn Laughlin, she argued that although most of our daily interactions outside of our family and friendship circles are with strangers, we have a means of minimizing their strangeness, whether it's through a short little comment that creates solidarity, whether it's through familiarity with someone wearing a Dodgers jersey and you like the Dodgers and whatnot. We have these numerous ways of minimizing strangeness. And in the context of the pandemic, however, we were denied those spaces to minimize strangeness. So the stranger was therefore informed by television, which of course relied off shock value and sensationalism, especially in the media. And in a way, I fault a lot of the media for, until they actually engaged in damage control, for bringing up tropes that racialized a lot of Americans. And in my case, as an Asian American, I was under severe stress.
Mm-hmm.
Every time I walked out of my door during the 2020 period with my spouse, I was hyper alert and ready for a fight every single day that I left my home. I got some stink eyes at the Walmart near Diamond Bar, but fortunately, because I stay fit, I think most people didn't pursue that. But perhaps if I were a little bit smaller, perhaps if I looked a little bit more vulnerable, I would have had a much greater degree of negative interactions with strangers. But Laughlin's theory failed in the context of the pandemic, because no one tried to minimize strangeness anymore. people were relying off tropes and stereotypes. Because of the way I looked, I felt extremely unsafe in that period of the American experience. In fact, my spouse and I have made some very compelling life decisions from that pandemic, and it's going to affect us forever. And the first one is we're moving out of this country, and I'm retiring early. I'm going to go back to where it all started for me, which is Thailand, where I grew up. I'm not retiring in the United States. I'm leaving. So we already decided on that. Because there, I know for a fact I'll never be called a chink or, kung flu and all of that stuff. I won't get the stink eye. I think there is some need for harmony right now. And if I don't see it in America, and I still don't really see it given the coming elections and the polarizations and whatnot, I don't know. I crave that right now. I crave some sort of familiarity and stability, which I don't see Americans being able to harness. Perhaps the pandemic kind of rotted something at the core of who we are, and we've not fully recovered. But I'm just being pessimistic, and I must admit I'm a bit pessimistic.
What did you think of the way the media handled stories about hate crimes against Asian Americans?
Well, I think they made some concerted efforts to show that it existed. I appreciated that, but this is not new. I think what Americans have to realize is that as much as we celebrate diversity, the problem with that celebration is whenever there's a crisis, someone in this diverse palette is put on the shit list, right? I mean, during the LA riots, Korean Americans were the target. Right now, you can say that anti-Semitism is on the rise because of what we see in the Mideast. So whenever there is a sort of crisis that affects and distracts Americans from being part of the shared humanity, well, one of the consequences of that is someone is put on the shit list. And I thank the media for showing that in this particular case during the pandemic, that Asian Americans were singled out. But this is not unprecedented. During World War II, of course, with Pearl Harbor, Japanese American citizens were put in concentration camps, essentially. And when Chinese Americans were outperforming in terms of wage discussions, the miners and the railroad workers during California's heyday, the Exclusion Acts were passed. So it made me see American history as filled with rhymes. Everything was rhyming. The present was rhyming the past, and it kind of left me a little bit discontented because it makes me wonder whether we will ever grow. We have this system that just allows people to throw tantrums. I mean, people were punching others on the plane. Asian American elders were being pushed onto subway tracks and whatnot. It was just disgusting to see, but it had to be seen. I have these mixed feelings about the way the media presented everything. I do. But I'm glad that when Asian Americans in urban environments united together, that they showed that too, because solidarity is important. And it was great to see so many different peoples from different cultures kind of back us up for that particular period.
I'm wondering if there's a collective amnesia about that 4 years ago. Because I think something that surprised me, this is when we did our interview with James on Asian American history, and I asked what percentage of the American population was Asian, and I was surprised that it was so low, but I realized that that's because I'm in Southern California. So the rest of the country doesn't have nearly as much interaction with Asian Americans, and it kind of allowed for this otherness to really, it seemed like it was just a storm of the panic, the rhetoric from the administration, and then also this brewing of otherness and needing to blame. And the cost to so many people's lives. I'm wondering if there's an amnesia about that. I mean, do people not remember how terrifying that was? Or maybe they just don't care because they don't have that many interactions with Asian Americans.
I think it's a little bit of both. I think along with that collective amnesia is this expression by those on the very conservative fringe that view whatever images that are shown on television where minority populations are suffering. I'm using this term because I saw a commenter use it on YouTube. And the commenter says this is all atrocity propaganda. And I thought to myself, okay, so you have someone who views this as atrocity propaganda mixed with a collective amnesia, then we're never going to learn. So yes, there is a sort of collective amnesia, but there's also an outright rejection of those who are suffering, seen in the context of detractors as viewing this as some sort of concocted propaganda about victimhood and whatnot. I think it's a very volatile mixture, but the collective amnesia is there. Americans are living in a state that is a very, very young state. We're 250 plus years old. A lot of people forget that in less than 100 years after 1776, 11 states broke away into essentially what was another country. So I think Americans need to learn how to, in a way, articulate what it means to have a shared humanity. And then we can learn better from one another. But yes, the collective amnesia is there. It's about parsing out all these people that other groups may not like, and other groups will like, and other groups may not like, and other groups will like. And because of this, we continue to make the same community mistakes of singling out people and putting them on a shit list when a particular crisis strikes. It's a very sad, dark side of multiculturalism, of diversity.
You were writing this in 2020.
Yes.
Now that you have some hindsight, is there anything that you've thought of that have you changed your mind on anything, or have you been more solidified an idea, or what kind of changes to the public space have been made post-COVID that have got you thinking about this topic?
Wow, that's such a great question. And that's such a great question, Gwen.
Thank you.
And I'll be very candid with you. I am guilty of, in the last 2 to 3 years, disconnecting from this notion of the American dream. I no longer had any ideals to sloganeer after that realization. I no longer felt that America was this thing that I personally could fix, whether as a cultural defender or as an activist. And partly this is due to my own shortcomings, because I am an existentialist, as you know, and I don't like labels. I don't like belonging to a group per se. So I was never really deeply connected with the AAPI community because, having grown up with minorities and grown up with a lot of people of Asian descent, I've seen minorities screw one another over all the time. So I never glorified these labels. And so in a way, I feel that my inability to actually think through this American process is partly my fault, because I was never fully connected with those people that I should experience solidarity with. Now, affectively, in terms of my emotions, I feel connected with them. When, for example, during the lockdown period, the Crunch gym I was at didn't want to shut down, so they moved their weights to the parking lot, and they cordoned off a big section of the parking lot for people to work out. And so during the winter of 2020, I was working out outside in the parking lot with other people. And when I saw someone who had those almond eyes like I did, I felt a bit of solidarity, and they felt a little bit safe. But that was the extent of my community building. And beyond that, I've not thought about repair. I've not thought about any sort of revitalization. I'm sad to say, I'm slowly checking out of this thing called the American dream. And I am letting the future generations, in a way, forward a better narrative than me. I've sort of had it up to here with the beautiful capitalist marketing of the cosmetic makeup that is America. I'm really sick of it. I wish people could just come here and take a look at some of the discontents we have and bring that more into the conversation, rather than let the mass media frame it as news, because they rely off shock value and sensationalism. Let me tell you something. Behind closed doors, the vast majority of Americans, in my view, are sick of one another in some sort of way. I look at universities and all these nice people sloganeering, celebrating this and that, using pronouns. But then I've had closed door discussions with a few of the more senior ones, and they're not taking it seriously. It's too much. It's a sort of distraction. This is sacrilegious for me to actually say, but I don't want to be part of that. I'd rather be detached and walk my own path and forward myself and those I love to a newer horizon, which in my case, as aforementioned, is going back to the motherland, to go back to where it all started. I'm no longer fully engaged with the United States of America right now. Maybe Kamala Harris might bring me back into the fold, who knows? But if Trump gets reelected, it is pretty much over. I mean, the fact that our democracy can reelect a guy like him, I mean, I don't know. I don't know what to say.
He has
I'm not sure
concepts
if I
of a
answered your
plan,
question.
Jack. You can't. Hang in there. Hang in there. If he gets elected, the concepts of a plan will come through.
I remember that.
I mean, my first reaction to the whole issue with demonizing the Haitians in Springfield was it was making me think about what happened during COVID. It's the first thing, and I'm thinking, wait, do we not remember what was going on there? But I want to go back to this question of strangers and public space, and I'll relate it to, not just coffee shops, but, the classroom, where to me, it is fascinating that I can look at all of my students. I mean, we're in Southern California, and if I were to put a map of the world up and I were to ask all my students, where are your grandparents from? We could probably cover the globe. And I think that that's extraordinary that here we all are in this one room, sharing this one space and reading the same text together and having these conversations. And so
Yeah.
that public space really allows for people who grew up in different, maybe economic backgrounds, ethnicities, race, religion, first language, to all be in the same space. And it seems like the way to allow for a society, a multicultural society, to flourish. So what I'm wondering then is, did COVID lockdowns bring something new or something that was always there that we didn't realize was there because of the public spaces?
That's a good question. In my particular chapter, I made operative a term called the third place. And third place is that environment where you have an informal public environment to convey your feelings and whatnot. And I do see the classroom as such an environment. I see the coffee shop as such an environment, the hair salon, the manicurist, those environments where people can be away from work and away from family just to communicate and whatnot. But in the classroom context, I think my views are not that sanguine, Gwen, because I think political correctness is creeping in. And yes, although everyone is diverse, that diversity also means ideological policing, where certain words can be used and cannot be used. I have met people that are offended when I say my wife because they prefer the word partner. I've had people ask me, why don't I have pronouns in my signature? And so I'm a little bit less optimistic about those spaces. But I think, though, the communicative lubricant that will allow for people to exhibit the solidarity that you so positively identify with, I think comes from the professors themselves. And maybe I am partly to blame if I did some inventory taking, because my classrooms personally are very cerebral, very atmospheric, very deep into trajectories of thought and consequences most young people who surf TikTok won't ever care about going to. But I think your classroom, Gwen, is a little bit more holistic, a little bit more wholesome, perhaps. And I would argue, perhaps, that philosophy won't have too many politically correct advocates that live their pieties very explicitly. But in the social sciences, boy, do they live those pieties very explicitly. And I personally feel like I'm walking on eggshells, to be honest with you, at this point in my career.
Yeah. Hey, Jack,
Yeah.
do you mind staying on that point just a little bit? Because
Yes.
that's really interesting. I was not expecting you to say that. I really
Mhm.
wasn't, because here I was with my own kind of biases thinking, well, these guys are professors. These guys are in the academic setting. These guys are used to this political correctness. These guys,
Mhm.
these, here I am saying these guys, these people,
Mhm.
speaking of being politically incorrect, these professors, they're used to this. This is what they deal with every day, and they like it and they promote it. And here I am hearing, no, this is extreme. This is uncomfortable. And I tell you, I mean, I feel like I walk on eggshells a lot too. I mean, I'm a very affable, friendly. You sometimes I have to overly consciously watch what I say. Not that I'm offensive. Not that I'm anything in any way, shape, or form. Like at my core, I love everyone and believe that in individualism and respect all of that. Being
Yeah.
the son of immigrants myself, but I too feel like I'm walking on eggshells.
Oh,
And
yeah.
the fact that you said that made me feel comfortable saying that on this
Mhm.
show. So, like,
Yeah.
thank you for admitting that.
Oh, absolutely.
What does that say about our society? And can I tell you? Can I tell you both?
Yeah.
Can I tell you both something?
Mhm.
I think a big part of Trump's rise, and I think the big part of Trump's staying power, is because he is taking the mantra of political correctness has gone extreme, political
Mhm.
correctness has gone wrong, wokeness, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm not saying that you said that. I'm not saying that either of us are saying that, but I'm telling you that is what he is saying. And I do think that's where his staying power is coming from. What do you
Mhm.
guys think about that? Is that too tough of a question?
No,
Not
I
at
think you're
all.
right. When I see people who are very anti the left side of politics, I'm trying to understand their anger and their fear. And a lot of it has to do with this idea of, oh, you're going to let men walk into women's bathrooms, and there's this real fear, or that they are going to be injured by criminals pouring over. At first, I think that the best way to have conversations is to acknowledge that somebody's coming from a place of anxiety and fear. And if you don't acknowledge that, then you can't have a conversation. Like, you can't just start with, well, that's stupid, or here's the statistics. It's like, no, wait, hold on. Understand that somebody has a legitimate fear, and then try to figure out, where that's coming from and how to talk through it. And I know, like in my classroom in critical thinking, I always stress that when you are listening to somebody's argument, understanding it and agreeing with it are two different things. But you should be able, in all honesty, to understand somebody's reasoning, even if you don't agree with it. But you have to start out with listening. You can't just walk into something and just yelling everything that you want to say. And so we tried to kind of untangle rhetoric from a factual claim, which is very difficult now because a lot of political speech is, or even, in media, is all a persuasive type of way of defining things. And then that gets people very, very excited.
I agree, Gwen. I think the blind spot here in the American political zeitgeist, if I can use that term, is that people are not willing to understand anymore. I think we've reached a sort of limit, and there's a sort of cultural reckoning. And those who are disaffected by all of this ideological policing are gravitating towards those they see as rebelling against it. And I think the reason why Trump is so appealing to so many is because he's this proverbial middle finger to all of that ideological policing. And he's obnoxious about it. He's willing to play dirty to take on what he views are these overblown pieties. And I think in a way it reflects how most Americans just don't buy it. Now, I think for thinkers like ourselves, even though we might be critical of this notion of political correctness as a means of thwarting community, I think we are intelligent enough to see all of the nuances and potential consequences of holding such views. But I don't think most Americans are willing to expend that type of intellectual labor. They don't want to understand anymore. They want quick sound bites, and they want absolutist statements. And then when you got someone like Trump who's a pro at both of those, people feel like, wow, he has a chance of becoming president. I like this person. So I think thinking has become a lot cheapened in the last few years. And as a disaffected liberal of the Bill Maher variety, if I can call myself that, I can't say I don't understand why those people are flocking to Trump. Although I certainly am not a Trumpist, I can see how we've taken this to the nth degree. And going back to you, Rudy, you'd be surprised how many faculty have had it up to here with this notion of diversity training and whatnot. They just can't come out and say it. This is why I remind students not to glorify academia, because I tell them this, and this horrifies them. I tell them that universities are not democracies. We don't elect our president for the university. We don't elect our provosts. Yeah, we elect a department chair, but in the larger scheme of things, they don't make the decision. The dean makes the decision. So I remind people that universities are not democracies. Overall, they're able to forward a very staunch view of some issue, and we're expected to oblige. And I think that's starting to rub a lot of people the wrong way. Now, I can say this because I'm only about 5 to 6 years from retirement. I empathize for all the young junior faculty who are not yet tenured that might actually have to do this. But like you, Rudy, there are some people that love this. There are social justice warriors out there. They love virtue signaling their awesomeness and how they're part of this greater project of righting inequalities. But I don't think inequalities can be resolved by a mutilation of language. I don't think inequalities can be resolved by new vocabulary that doesn't deal with material consequences. You see?
I think that's a very good point, Jack. I mean, I think, whether or not somebody puts pronouns in their email signatures, to me, I mean, maybe that signals some kind of, hey, you're in a safe space. I suppose that might be that argument, but I guess I would want people to get to know me and know that I'm a safe person like that.
Yes.
I mean, there's plenty of people that have these fake signals of niceness out front, and that, oh no, I'm safe. And then you talk to them, and they're some of the most racist, homophobic people you've ever met in your entire life. You know what I mean? Like I don't like to pull the wool over anybody's eyes.
Yeah.
It's just a really interesting point in our culture right now where we talk about the right and we talk about the left, and the left is painted in this big umbrella of social justice and political correctness, and the right is completely painted as a bunch of fascist racists. And that's just, and by the way, I'm sure there's wings of that in our party, but it's when you start to focus on the extremes so much is when the country can actually fall apart. Because like when you say that, oh, well, all Republicans are racist, or everyone on the right is racist, let's go after them, let's get rid of them, let's get them out of power. I mean, that's when the glue that keeps this country together is going to start to be torn apart. And that's ultimately my fear. My ultimate fear is what's the future of the United States of America? I love this place passionately, and there needs to be room where people feel comfortable, whether people feel comfortable with political correctness, people feel comfortable not being politically correct. I mean, I don't know what the answer is, but this is what I struggle with. And a lot of this came out in your paper and sociology and COVID. And I think COVID came, quote unquote, at the right time because our country was heading towards this battle. And I think where the pandemic in and of itself really forced people to look in the mirror.
Yeah.
As a country, we had to look at the mirror, and we're still looking at that mirror, and that mirror will always be there. We have a lot of reckoning to do.
Right. And I think your voice, along with Gwen's sentiments, I mean, that's the centrism we need. And there is no centrism in the American political landscape right now. And I think that's a sign of how frustrated we are on both sides. I do wonder what the future holds for this country. I hope there will one day rise a very capable leader that has very centrist, pragmatic views of things. But I'm sure you're going to have people deconstructing what pragmatism means. And then, of course, we go back and start over all again. And the sickness, I think, is people are fighting with language and terminology today. And when you begin your fight with language and terminology, you'll never get to the material consequences of things. When you're spelling words differently because the initial spelling was offensive to some people, you're never going to be able to get to where your fingers get dirty in the field. And I think, that's something Americans aren't willing to acknowledge because they think by reinterpreting words, by using new words, we can shape public policy. Yes, but public policy is a little bit arrogant in of itself because it's expected to trickle down to everyone. And I think, in a way, the social scientists today, especially the sociologists who've really become, many of them have become obsessed with this social justice thing. I think sociologists need to come back down to the people and just talk to perhaps someone who's a street vendor selling food on the street. Like, what is one of the top 3 issues bothering you every day? I think we should start from there, but we're not. We're starting with how a word is spelled, whether a pronoun is used. I think we should go to a laundromat owned by a Cambodian family, or we should talk to even a white working class individual to see whether J.D. Vance's book really captures the sentiments of people in Appalachia.
Absolutely.
You see, right? Absolutely. But we're not going there. We're starting from the top, and we float in this atmosphere of it all. And we're not bringing everything down to earth. So I think there are a lot of disaffected people in the center that are not being heard. And I'm so glad to be here with both of you that can kind of manage your way through that centrality, which is where I see myself, really.
Gwen, what are your thoughts as a fellow centrist? Or at least, whether or not you're a centrist on this show, you're definitely a centrist. Whereas I know deep down to my bone, I'm a center, maybe center left, but definitely a centrist.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to introduce a couple of potential causal factors here. Jack, Rudy, myself, there's a possibility that we are grumpy Gen Xers. I'm just going to throw that out there, that we're like one step away from yelling at a kid to get off our lawn. Maybe we have turned into the parody of the boomers. But this idea of the physical infrastructure, the physical space that was then removed. I mean, one picture in your essay is of the LA freeway, and it is just astonishing to see it empty like that.
Yes.
And with this removal of the physical public space, what the vacuum then has been the virtual public space. Like Elon Musk talks about Twitter or X as the new public square, or we've got TikTok or Instagram or Facebook, that this is now supposed to be the public square. But the problem with it, and this is back to, this idea of the third place and the interaction with strangers, you have that interaction with strangers, except it's just one short-sighted. Like I make a TikTok, I'm just looking at the camera at myself and then waiting for people to comment. That's not the same thing as being in a
Yeah.
place and being able to, let's say, read somebody's expressions. That kind of interaction, or even with dating apps, this idea of you meeting
Mm,
somebody based on a picture on their profile and then you go see them in person and their character, the way that they move, like all of that stuff is missing when we get rid of what your book is calling about this third space, and how important that is
mhm,
to be around
mhm,
our
mhm.
neighbors and to interact with them. The virtual
Yeah.
social square is not going to
Yeah. Yeah.
replace the physical one. It cannot.
Yes, yes. I'd love to add 2 points to that, Gwen, because your first point about us potentially being a little bit grumpy, I cannot deny that because
We've
believe it
joked
or
about it
not,
before, being
Gwen,
grumpy Gen Xers.
No, this is fascinating because about a month ago, I read a news report written by this journalist who said that the late 80s until the mid 90s was the most domestically and comparatively speaking, the most domestically and geopolitically stable period in American history. And we all came from that period. We were teens during that period. So maybe we are disaffected because we were spoiled. You're right about that, and I cannot deny that it's a wonderful hypothesis. Maybe we ourselves, by sitting here speaking this way, are a bunch of idealists,
Mm-hmm.
right? But the other point I want to bring up is you're absolutely right on with this notion of how, with the deadening of physicality in our spatial environments, the virtual takes over. And, years ago, got a publication out about online teaching, and there were people from Canada who at that time were promoting something known as MOOCs. That was a sexy term for a while, and it somewhat evaporated. Massive open online courses. And these folks were writing articles about how the university is the physical aspect of university, the brick and mortar, the place that you go to learn. That's passé. These are folks that were hoping that there will one day be a university that is purely online and therefore allow the online aspects of its existence to destroy geography altogether. They were talking about creating online universities that would enroll 300 million students. I mean, think
Wow.
about that. Yeah, they were talking about universities that would enroll millions of students and hopefully and they were prescient here, hopefully one day having a sort of AI that would have a Turkish professor teach about Turkish history, and that AI would translate immediately for the listener the language the listener is comfortable with. And you would no longer need this brick and mortar existence. And I see that slowly happening. I mean, one thing we saw about the pandemic was how little the third space really matters to community health, how people didn't think about reinvigorating that as a commonly accepted philosophy. They did so economically. Restaurants were starting to open after the COVID subsided, but there was no unifying philosophy on how, look, we need to bring back this thing called the third space or the third place. We need to bring that back as principle, on principle. There was no cohesive narrative about that. It came back in little driblets. Now that we have increasing crime in certain areas of our urban lives, third places like malls, like retail, they're going to die a slow death too, because online logistics is what's the new Santa Claus. They're going to give us the things we want. And when I buy stuff as an Amazon Prime member, I feel a little bit more secure. So who knows? Maybe this physical space that builds community, Gwen, is on its way out. Who knows? I hope it doesn't go too soon, but maybe it's on its way
Do you
out.
think there could be a burnout where do you see that potential happening, that we eventually get burned out from scrolling and shouting on the internet and want to return to spaces? And I mean, I'm just thinking about this value of it. There's a book by Stephen Johnson that was, oh my goodness, what was the book? It was something on where ideas come from, where great ideas come from. And he was tracing breaks in major thinking to coffee shops and the way that they opened up,
Mm,
and then these minds interacting, and then you had these incredible breakthroughs. So the idea of
yeah,
closing all those spaces, I don't see incredible breakthroughs happening from people shouting their political views online, because there's no
yeah,
collaboration. Like everybody's just
yeah.
yelling at each other what their point is.
Yeah. Well, let me respond to that by talking a bit about the captive audience. I was made privy a long time ago to a particular anecdote about Mark Zuckerberg and a bunch of dot-com industry proponents who had gone to the Bay Area to get funding for what we today would call social media. And the refrain I heard from those who funded folks like Zuckerberg and whatnot is that they were delighted and gleeful about the opportunities of having what they termed, and I quote, captive audience, unquote. Now, this thing that is emerging online to build these quasi communities, I feel they might have a lot more staying power than I personally would like. And that's because they see us as a captive audience. We don't have to wait for a store to open at 9 a.m. in the morning. If I wanted to buy cheese from Sweden, I don't have to wait for Trader Joe's to open in the morning. I can go to a Swedish retailer based out of Gothenburg and order from their website. So I think the captive audience is here to stay. The question is, to what extent will they try to inculcate a particular culture into the captive audience? Will they try to define our mysticism online rather than at, say, a mosque or a church or a synagogue or at a Buddhist temple? Will they try to tell us how to be human with an Android or an AI voice online? Or will we get that from persons like you, Gwen, or you, Rudy? That's the only question. I think the captive audience is here to stay. Again, I go back to Nietzsche. Unfortunately, I think most people are followers in this universe. They want the easy way out. And if you can give them information that they don't necessarily have to be accountable for, like we would have to be accountable for at a bar or at a restaurant when we make a point, that environment is extremely alluring to those people. So unfortunately, going to the dark side once again, Gwen, I think that space is here to stay. This captive place online, freed of boundaries, where people can find comfort in getting their esteem validated by strangers. It's too alluring.
I'm really struck with, Rudy, I'm wondering if you've had this experience at all, but when I dropped my daughter off for TK, she's in TK, and she did preschool last year, that the way that she just runs into the classroom and the other kids, they all just gravitate to each other. They're different ethnicities, different races, all different shades, and they just run to each other and say hello. It's nothing. So I'm just wondering.
It's beautiful.
Yeah. She has a concept of like her skin tone, but there's nothing negative attached to that. There's no history or discrimination attached to it. It's just a fascination with her body and the way that other people are. And so I'm wondering, since that seems to be the real human spirit, the real human condition, that like you've got the home life and then we drop off and the kids run and they greet each other and then they play. If we can't recapture that authentic human experience in some way, like see where does that stop? Where and what is making that stop, so that we can kind of return to that and be that way as adults, because that's the genuine human condition, it seems to me, to greet people, say hello, ask how they're doing, be in awe of each other, be inspired by each other.
Yeah. Can I add to that, really? I think that's such a great point, because what you're pointing out, Gwen and Rudy, is that we don't only know from books and from TikTok and from our favorite YouTube subscribed channels. We know because of our bodies. Our bodies are epistemic. And so there's a sort of epistemology about who we are in this universe simply from a hug or a handshake. And I think your kids being able to do that is so wonderful. It's so wonderful. And it gives me hope. Maybe this is a cliche, but the hope is in our young children, which incidentally in America, they're getting shot at schools. So I question whether or not we even have freedoms anymore to send our kids to school without having that beautiful dynamic being disrupted by trauma. But I look outside my townhouse. These Indian kids are playing with my Mexican neighbors. They're riding their bikes. They're talking about bike parts with their neighbors, and it's just so beautiful. So the body, the physical body, is a site of knowledge, and we're denying that humanity now. So I hope one day good people like you, and I'll have to remind myself the same, to bring back the physicality of our humanness, of our shared humanity, rather than have some online universe or some website or some talking head in an AI generated voice determine that for us.
Well, I'll throw this out to Rudy, because the picture of the freeway that was emptied, it made me wonder a couple of things. It made me wonder, does the freeway count as a public space if we're all in our cars? And then the other thing is that Rudy did public transportation all the time. Rudy, what have you seen about that public space of public transportation?
Yeah, so good point. But what you can see if you research anything having to do with public transit, that since the pandemic and since the work from home movement is still alive and relatively strong, public transit has fallen off of what's known in our circle as the fiscal cliff. The fiscal cliff meaning a lot of transit systems might need to cut service because they don't have enough funds or enough users. Yet by cutting service, they're actually going to lead to even less people using them. And so it becomes this terrible death spiral. Now, the good news is things are starting to turn into the right direction. Public transit is coming back, definitely in areas like the Bay Area. Like BART's numbers are finally starting to come back up, and other numbers are starting to come back up, but they're not yet at the pre-COVID levels. The interesting thing is I did some investigation, and even before the pandemic, transit numbers were starting to drop in certain cities, like in Los Angeles. Los Angeles has got a very unique transit system, very unique transit story. LA is created and spread out because of transit, because the old transit system, the Pacific Railway car, was owned by real estate developers, and they had these trains going everywhere and you can go anywhere. And then that got taken over once the automobile became ubiquitous. We don't need to get into it. You can go watch Who Framed Roger Rabbit to go learn that conspiracy theory. But as far as transit being a public space, I couldn't agree more. I like taking transit because I am among everyone in Los Angeles. I mean, I actually take it from the South Bay, which is one of the wealthier areas of Los Angeles. I take it from here and I take it all the way to downtown LA, and I feel like an Angelino. And I talk to people and, tourists that are flying in from LAX come and they ask me for some advice about where to go here and where to go there. And, I'm always keeping my eyes open on the train for anybody that needs help. But I also feel very safe on the train. I mean, I'm a tall guy, athletic guy. Certain people just don't feel safe, and that is unfortunate. And LAMTA is trying to put even more public safety officers on the transit system so people do feel safe, and that's vitally important because we're going to have the Olympics here in 4 years.
That's right.
And some use of public transportation is going to be required to move around that many people. Unfortunately, not all of the projects that are needed to make the Olympics kind of a seamless public transportation operation are going to be built in time, but this doesn't matter. There's trains, planes, whatever it's going to be, buses. We're going to need public transportation for the Olympics, and people need to feel safe. So there's this interesting balance here, right? Like, it's a public space. This is great. You can feel, like you're amongst people. You can feel like you're amongst your community, that you're a community member. Yet if people don't feel safe and legitimately don't feel safe, like I have a friend that's super high up at the metro who got attacked on a subway car, like by a homeless person. She is like really up there, and she got attacked. And she's like, I can't believe this. Like this is awful. She immediately called like the transit police and reported it. She just was disgusted because here's this entity that she works for and works really hard for and uses every single day. And she got attacked and now feels scared to ride it sometimes. It's a tough balance, there's safety versus community, and there's all kinds of issue with public transportation where, my mindset of it is I will use it. This is terrible. If I have time to use it, if I'm not in a rush to go somewhere, I will always use public transit. One of the main reasons why is so I can do other work. I can do some work on my phone. I could read a book. I can write something. I could listen to a podcast. Basically, I'm delegating the driving to somebody else so I can do some, I like to call it smart multitasking. But of course, once again, I feel safe on the train. Not everybody does. And so that needs to be addressed.
Yeah. I was thinking about this third space that I'm very introverted, but when I go into public spaces, like I'll go to a cafe to work. So it's like I still want to be solitary, kind of like Rudy on the train, solitary, but there is something so uplifting about being in a place where there's other people. And even when I travel, I mean, I don't want to stay in the hotel room, right? I want to go on the main streets and be around everybody. Even though I'm introverted, I don't want to shake hands with everybody, but there is something so uplifting about being around everybody. And so that might be some of the depression that you saw in your students during COVID, because you can't have that uplifting experience of being in the hustle and bustle and, organization of everybody around you.
Yeah. And I think to sum up what both of you have said, what I'm hearing is, and I completely agree with this, is that, the public space is a community for some, but depending on the cultural climate, a frontier for other people. if you go to Thailand right now in Bangkok and you jump on any train, you'll love it. And that's because there's a sort of etiquette in Bangkok when you take the train. You're not supposed to speak aloud. People who get on the trains are quiet. They don't really talk. It's part of the etiquette prescription of being on public trans in Thailand. You'll always know who the tourists are because they're always the ones talking, right? So every culture, I think, prescribes a sort of ointment for how we deal with that particular place, the physical aspects of it. Los Angeles, I think, is going through a difficult period. I think they're trying to convince our residents to look at the public space of public trans as a safe environment. And I think there's still work that needs to be done, though. And I'm really sorry that happened to your colleague, Rudy, because I can imagine what that must be like, let's say, during the lockdown period where you had to take public trans to get to work because you were grateful you were still employed, but I just wanted to throw that out.
Yeah, no. It was just kind of one of those interesting things that the reality is women just don't feel as safe on public transportation as men do. Yeah. And that needs to be addressed. Then that absolutely needs to happen if the people want to take public transit to the next level. That's my opinion.
I mean, one other thing that I think has changed the public space that has me not fearful in terms of physical harm, but it's the presence of cell phones and knowing that anybody could take a video of you at any time. Maybe you're having a bad day, not your best moment, and then all of a sudden become a meme and are completely defined in every way by that moment. And that's also, I think, something that has kind of threatened the public space is that, you want to go to a cafe, you don't want to hear somebody on their phone or taking pictures of everything in a restaurant. And that is also kind of a threat because it's a strange type of isolation and at the same time invasion. There's just so much going on now where the public space has shifted. Well, Jack, thank you so much for your work. Thank you for joining us again. It is such a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you to both
your brain
of you
about these issues. Because like I said, I think that there's some amnesia about the seriousness and the psychological impacts of the change in infrastructure.
Yeah. And, when I speak to both you, Gwen, and Rudy, I feel like I learn a great deal because I don't get to have these conversations with my colleagues because we're always talking about enrollment.
Yeah.
It's very mathematical. We don't pick our brains like this. So I appreciate both of your time today.
Thank you, Jack. Always a pleasure.
All right. I send you both my love and my best.
Yes, sir. Same to you.
Good is in the Details is produced by Dr. Gwendolyn Dolske and Rudy Salo. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, please scroll down to the bottom and hit that 5-star review. You can check us out on Instagram, Good is in the Details Pod, and you can connect with us on Patreon. Support the podcast, get extra content, and join our book club. That's patreon.com/Good is in the Details. And if you would like to start your own podcast, but you don't know where to begin, how to transform that idea into a successful podcast, look in the link below to get my course. We'd also like to thank our sponsor for this episode, AvonmoreInc.com. It's that small business that started in the 90s and grew to an international bridge sensation. Do you play bridge or do any of your friends play bridge? You have to check out AvonmoreInc.com. They have everything you need for your next bridge party. Tallies, coasters, smart playing cards, which are also great for kids. Go to AvonmoreInc.com and let them know Good is in the Details sent you. Thank you so much, Dr. Fong, for joining the pod once again. And everyone, stay tuned because we have some giveaways coming up next month. Okay, until next time, bye.